This is Shadows Over Loathing, and yes, it is supposed to look like that, just in case you're not aware. This is, of course, the third game in the Loathing, well, it's not exactly a series, sort of, but yeah, the third Loathing game, and it all started off with, of course, Kingdoms of Loathing, which was a really fun and quite funny browser MMO back in the day. It had some good writing and some fun areas, my favorite being the misspelled cemetery, personally, but then these guys decided to actually create a full-on retail release, like an actual, fully Steam-released video game. And in that case, they made West of Loathing, which was a really good, very funny, Wild West-themed game that did a good job of mixing a sort of point-and-click style of exploration with some turn-based combat, and was pretty well received because it was really good. But then they schemed a devious scheme, and they decided to secretly develop a new game in, presumably, the silence of the ruins of a research facility abandoned somewhere in the New Mexico desert. And then they just suddenly dropped it on Steam, just full release. Here you go, not early access or anything, no real marketing beforehand, just here's a new game. And that's how we got Shadows Over Loathing, which is of course a more cosmic horror themed entry, just in case the name itself didn't clue you in on that. And you are an investigator that is going through this world trying to find these various cursed artifacts, learn their histories, and uncurse them at the behest of a mysterious person that has somehow disappeared, involving some other nonsense from the void, we'll say, and getting embroiled in all sorts of various plots along the way. You'll start out by choosing your class, all of which are amazing. I chose the Cheese Wizard, personally, because, I mean, come on, you can't put something called a Cheese Wizard in your game and expect me not to pick it. The only thing that I would personally find better would be like a sort of soup-based necromancer of some kind, using different soups to actually raise the dead, so you could have like a minion minestrone for your basic zombies, a goulash for the stronger versions, maybe a New England bone chowder for raising some zombies, and some ghost gazpacho. I'm not sure what you would actually call the class, maybe like a broth romancer or a ladle lich or something like that. But regardless of the game's complete lack of soup-based undead summoning, the classes are actually quite different and really fun because there are a pretty wide variety of different moves that you can actually get for each class, and also a large grid of different passive effects that you can purchase with experience. But first off, we gotta talk about how the game is split, because the game sort of has two main forms of its gameplay. It has the exploration, which is sort of based on like point-and-click adventure games, and it has its actual turn-based combat. The exploration is what you'll be doing most of the time, and it simply involves walking around the place. You may find all sorts of different pairs of shoes that allow you to walk around the place differently, maybe even float around the place or walk on your hands or cartwheel, but regardless, you will be locomoting around the place in various different ways and just rubbing your face on everything and seeing what it does, because almost every object in the game has some sort of description, either from your character or from the narrator in general, so you'll be just walking around trying to find things to interact with, viewing all sorts of flavor text, and of course conversing with tons and tons of NPCs. There are loads and loads of side quests in this game to get lost in, as well as a pretty lengthy main quest involving, like I mentioned earlier, the investigative process of these occult artifacts and their uncursing. There are also a lot of puzzles to solve in this game, some of which are like inventory puzzles where you simply find a thing that you need, like a key or a quest item of some kind, and bring it to someone or somewhere to use it. Other times they are more involved, like for instance the SIT puzzles, which is basically like a 2-hour college crash course. And there are all sorts of puzzles for that, like logic puzzles. There's like a cooking one with all sorts of various ingredient requirements, and even some like skill checks and things. And there's also one that involves music and actually getting a sequence of notes in different orders to satisfy different requirements. The game actually has a very large, kind of semi-open world kind of setting, where you'll have large hub areas, and that each have a whole bunch of different sub-areas in that zone that you can explore to. You'll know because you'll get a map for each individual area, and that map will have all the various different sections you can explore, and then you can take a bus to any of the different mapped areas, which will have their own entire new map screen full of new areas to explore. So the game is actually really huge, and there's a whole bunch of different places. Notably, by the way, the maps are almost never actually real maps. They're usually something ridiculous, like drawn on a napkin, or they're just a postcard that you doodled on, or they're a sponge that you can draw a map on. I'm not sure how that one works. And you simply go to the map screen and just select any of the various different zones across that map that you can travel to. And as you're traveling, you'll often come across various random events. Sometimes they're combat, sometimes they're skill checks for extra experience, sometimes they give you crafting ingredients, other times they reveal entirely new map areas that you can explore later. And then once you actually get to a zone, you can walk around in it, and there's usually a lot of stuff to explore in each zone. Lots of buildings to go in, secret passages to find, skill checks to pass, and all sorts of other things, including usually lots of NPCs and side quests as well. So this game is absolutely packed with content. It is just full to the brim with stuff to do. Every area is really large, every area has its own map full of all kinds of things to do, and each of those individual zones on that map is going to have at least one NPC to talk to, some fights to do, and all sorts of other things to do. So if you're looking for a more involved RPG to pass some time, this is definitely definitely a good candidate, because there really is deceptively large once you actually get into it. There's just a ton to explore here. But then the other half of the game, of course, is the combat, which is a turn-based, almost JRPG-like combat system, where your side and the enemy party take turns based on their stats in order to just do things, and you will always have a description of the enemy's intent, so you'll always know what they're about to do on their next turn, and that can help you strategize. So there is actually some strategy to the combat. They've definitely done a good job of diversifying the combat system in comparison to West of Loathing, which I'm pretty sure was actually a goal of theirs, to make it more involved, more mechanically interesting, and I think they've actually done a pretty good job. You'll have all sorts of usable items that you can use, as well as AP that you use on various skills, usually your class skills and some other things like equipable offhand items. They all take AP to use, and then you have your actual main attack, which doesn't take AP but does end your turn. So you're encouraged to use your AP strategically by using your various skills in whatever order you want, and then ending your turn with a big final attack. And this is one of the rare RPGs where your character's actual main attack is actually one of their most powerful skills in general, which is usually not how it works. Usually like some expensive skill to cast is your big damage dealer, but in this case, they're more like utility based and stuff. They can deal a lot of damage, but oftentimes your main burst damage is actually what ends your turn. As a cheese wizard, I have access to all sorts of cheese-based magic, like a sort of magic missile sort of attack that just does physical damage to one enemy, a multi-target sleaze damage attack that is very useful actually, an ability to actually do hot damage to an enemy based on their mysticality stat, which is basically like intelligence, and even the ability to stack a bunch of on-fire debuffs to enemies around the battlefield randomly to deal damage over time. So you do get quite a large selection, depending on your class, of various skills to use, and these skill books are actually multi-use, because simply reading a skill book will teach you whatever skill it has in it, but you keep it afterwards because you can read it again to spend a permanent burst of experience to upgrade that skill in some way. And these are usually really worth having. Almost all of them upgrade the skill in some pretty significant way that makes it something that you want to save up for and do generally. You will get experience mostly, of course, for actually beating battles, but you can also get it in various other ways, like passing certain skill checks and just doing certain random things will sometimes award you with experience. And you don't level up or anything like that. There isn't an experience gauge that levels you up at a certain threshold. Instead, you spend the experience like a currency on things. So like the aforementioned skill upgrades you can spend experience on, but also depending on your class, you'll have a big grid of passive improvements that you can spend experience on as well that will increase your stats or give you boosts to certain damage resistances or do many other things, and they're really useful to have actually, and there's quite a large variety of them to actually spend your points on. And you can even sometimes find other books that aren't exactly skill books but are instead passive books that add a multi-upgradable passive skill that you can read the book multiple times and spend multiple increasing amounts of experience on to improve. So there's a lot of different ways to spend your experience. It is quite a valuable resource. In battle, you'll also be joined by a familiar. You can actually equip various different familiars from your inventory. You can get them in all sorts of ways. You can purchase them from a pet shop. You can find them from a random event. You can do all sorts of things. But each familiar has its own stats and its own different things that it does. And as you complete battles with it equipped, it will improve its stats over time. And you can also have another party member that you can swap out during the game. You'll get one early on that's a pretty useful party member with a nice, strong basic attack and a heal. But as you complete more quests and visit more places, you will collect more party members that you can potentially switch out whenever you want. And all of that, of course, brings us to the writing of the game, because that's very important in a game with this much dialogue and writing. This game is a lot of reading because, like I mentioned earlier, it clearly takes some cues from early point-and-click adventure games and things. So there's a lot of like rubbing your face on stuff to see what it says about it, reading dialogue trees and things like that. So you do have to be patient. You know, if you're the kind of person that is only in it for combat, like pure action, this is probably not the RPG for you, but it is really well written in my opinion, and the dialogue is actually really funny, and the descriptions are generally really funny as well. Now, obviously, I have to preface this by saying, of course, humor is very subjective, so what I find funny, you might personally not find all that funny, but I really do genuinely find the writing style of this game very funny. It's got that sort of smart person jokes for dumb people kind of humor that I really like. It's like they could almost be smart jokes if they weren't so stupid in their delivery, and I really appreciate that. I think it's really funny. That's just the sort of humor that I really enjoy. It's somewhat absurdist at times, it's a little bit self-referential, there's some like video game jokes in here, but not too many to the point that it gets grating. A little bit of fourth wall breaking sprinkled in there, but again, not too much of that. All topped off with a scoop of like general genre parody and stuff that really ties it together, and in my opinion does make it very funny. And it helps that it actually is well written as well. Like the story being told here is genuinely interesting, probably because I love noir and I love cosmic horror, so I'm really into that sort of thing. But I also am a big fan of the whole investigative, like finding crazy artifacts sort of idea, so really the story is perfect for me, and it does a good job at all of those things that it sets out to do, while being a bit of a pastiche of the genre in general, but also not trying too hard to parody anything in particular. This is a game that's very easy to get lost in and just lose a bunch of time to, because you'll just set out to explore one more area for the night, and then you'll end up going down like 5 different dialogue trees and 10 different NPCs later and like 3 side quests, and you end up finding a couple of secret areas and some other skill checks that lead to even more areas with more skill checks, and you just get lost in all the writing and all the silliness, and you get really involved in this sort of cosmic horror, noir-ish atmosphere. And it's actually kind of amazing to me how engrossing and atmospheric a game that looks like this can actually be. What they have lacked in their art budget for these games, they have made up for in just pure, genuine character. The game's only like $20, and there's just so much to do here. It's so stuffed with content, so many things to discover and plot lines to develop and new interesting things to find. It just keeps going. You know, I feel like every time I think I've explored all of the areas in a certain zone, there's just more. It feels like every time you turn over a rock in this game, you find like 12 new NPCs and a whole bunch of new side quests and things. It's just, that's the kind of game that it is. It's an adventure RPG. It's a game about the adventure. It's there to get you interested in the world and actually have a really fun, well-spun yarn to follow through all these different areas, and it does a really good job of creating a simultaneously very funny but also cohesive storyline for you to follow with actual permanent characters that aren't just made of jokes entirely so that there's no impact to anything. But it still, of course, has that loathing style of humor to everything as well, so I'm aware that some people might not enjoy that because this game is so focused on its own specific style of humor. If that doesn't really click for you, you know, then you're probably going to have a hard time actually enjoying this game because it's suffused throughout everything about the game. You know, you gotta kind of like its humor style to get anything out of it, which I guess is the danger of making a game that is so heavily reliant on its thing, on its style like this. But I think that the plus side to doing that is if you are into it, it becomes so engrossing that you have a hard time pulling yourself away from it. So yeah, this is an easy to recommend game. I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can check it out yourself. Like I said, it's only $20, and for the very large amount of content that's on offer here, that is really hard to ignore. I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to show or say anything that spoils too much or just gives you too much of a dose of the game. I really want you to experience it for yourself. This is a game best discovered at your own pace, in your own way. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.